Women in Doctor Who. They scream. They need rescuing. They wear the strangest things. And yet they're brave. They're kind.
You alright, mate?
Yeah.
And they make the Doctor a better person. They might teach us something too.
But I'm only a girl. Just a minute. There's nothing only about being a girl, Your Majesty.
Doctor Who began in November 1963. The BBC at the time was a male-dominated establishment, but Doctor Who was put into the hands of the BBC's first woman producer, Verity Lambert.
It's a big burden to load on one woman's shoulders that, somehow, because she's a woman, the whole show, what does it say about women in the 60s? The innovation probably came in the idea of a show that was a bit later than children's TV, it was a lot darker than traditional children's TV. But actually look at how it's populated, and the women in it are kind of, whiny, and they're kind of high-pitched, their voices. And they're kind of going around looking like Margaret Thatcher, that sort of idea of women just being quite domestic with the kind of set hair and the sort of corsets. And I'm struck by how tied down in sort of almost 50s values those early female characters are. And yet the adventure was clearly groundbreaking and very new.
But what was the BBC like for the women that worked there in the 1960s? What difference did Verity Lambert make to Doctor Who and the BBC? How different did that make Doctor Who from other TV programmes?
People forget that there was a huge row over women doing much. Women newsreaders, for example, there was a huge scandal over that. So perhaps it isn't so surprising that in drama, the women aren't really given major parts. They're somehow a foil to the adventure, which is sort of for the men.
So how much did Doctor Who girls challenge sexist clichés in the 1960s? And how true is the cliché that the girls were there to scream, twist their ankles and get captured?
Not a sign of any people, anything.
I think the screaming, twisted ankle cliché of Doctor Who, to begin with, was fairly prevalent. But then Susan is supposed to be quite a young girl.
Don't be angry with me. There was no real harm done, was there? I just twisted my ankle and my head.
No harm done, child. No harm done, no. Do you realise we can't get into the ship? And what's all this rubble then? Look at it.
I didn't pour the bridge down on purpose.
It just adds that minor peril that I don't think is necessarily a sexist showing of the character.
We shall be as quick as we can. And you bathe that ankle. What you need is a jolly good smack bottom. Come on.
It's unfortunate that it's shown immediately after having seen a dead body drift down the river, because it's quite a shocking contrast between the two. You've got the tension and then you've got her being ever so slightly silly.
When Susan returned to the series 20 years later, she seemed largely remembered as the girl who twisted her ankle.
Can you walk? Oh, just about.
But she could be a much more complex and rounded character.
He knew. He knew you could never leave him.
Will prove to the people that you don't
In the first
need to
two series,
sacrifice
there
a
was
human
also
being in
Barbara.
order to make it red.
She could lay down the law to the
Barbara,
Doctor.
no.
It's no good, Doctor. My mind's made up. This is the beginning of the end of the Sun God.
What are you talking about?
Oh, don't you see? If I could start the destruction of everything that's evil here, then everything that is good would survive when Cortez lands.
But you can't rewrite history. Not one line.
It was in a way not then about sexual attraction, which is sort of what's happened to Doctor Who. It was these young people having adventures with the Doctor, and in a way they were more equal, I think.
Sarah Kingdom seemed designed in the mould of the Avengers girls. But for much of the 1960s, Doctor Who girls were ordinary women we could relate to. Dodo and Polly were girls of their time, going to trendy nightclubs and wearing the trendiest clothes. Vicky and Victoria were both young orphans the Doctor had to look after. Perhaps their being ordinary is a virtue. They're not super clever or strong, so it's even more of an achievement when they step up to do the extraordinary things that the Doctor's adventures demand. But the Doctor's next companion was something else. A dab hand at martial arts. And a brilliant physicist.
Quite logical, really. Hardly any calculation needed at all. Except for simple stuff like speed, angle of descent, and relative positions of the spaceships.
Can't we keep her on, sir? She's much prettier than a computer.
Zoe and Liz, who followed her, might even have been smarter than the Doctor.
Right, I'll get on to it. Maybe we can get him at the station. Will you come with me, Miss Shaw?
Oh, I'm helping the doctor.
I'll need help manning the phones.
I am a scientist, not an office boy.
You're a member of UNIT, Miss Shaw, and you'll do as you're told.
I will not be spoken to in that way.
Liz,
Doctor.
go with him, please.
Perhaps this was too much too soon. The producers of Doctor Who were keen to return to the ordinary girl next door, so the brilliant grown-up scientist was replaced by the teenage Jo.
What's a cephalopod?
An octopus. I thought you took an A-level in science.
I didn't say I passed.
In the early 1970s, there was a conscious effort to address issues of women's liberation.
Sarah, why don't we stay and have a few words with the Queen? I have an idea you could give us some good advice.
Watching these storylines where Sarah Jane is going on about women's lib, it's quite weird. It reinforces my view, which is that there was a lot of male producers who thought it was quite amusing, sort of wind up the feminist and let her off.
Well, it's going to be rather difficult to explain, but I think he was referring to women's lib. And what's that? Women's liberation, Your Majesty. On Earth, it means, well, very briefly, it means that we women don't let men push us around.
So I think the motive was actually quite a dodgy one, and yet, because the acting is so superb and her character is so fascinating, I think for young girls watching, and I guess I was one of them, we took the positive side, even if there was a slightly more dubious intent behind it.
Don't you want to be free?
Women will never be free while there are men in the world, girl. We have our place.
What subservient poppycock! You're still living in the Middle Ages.
Eh?
Despite the fact that she's in this castle, she has no idea where she is or how she got there. All she can think of is liberating women. And that's brilliant. I think that's absolutely perfect.
And Sarah Jane was followed by an even more fiercely independent character.
That wasn't necessary. Who licensed you to slaughter people? No more Janus thorns, you understand, ever.
What's interesting as a female viewer is that I can watch Leela and just see a terrific actress who's this fascinating character, in spite of the fact that she's wearing a leather bikini. And the acting almost overcompensates, has to overcompensate for the fact that the premise on which these women are introduced is often quite shady.
Yes, she's got that the savage, and she may be wearing the slightly sexualised loincloths and skins, but she's empowered. She's not aware that to us that's not a socially acceptable thing.
Is something wrong?
No. Would you care for a knife or a fork?
It's a good knife.
After Leela, there were more scientists, who often knew more than the Doctor.
Well.
Good.
Thank you, Doctor.
No, it was very, very good. Wasn't that good, K9?
Very, very, very good, Master.
Oh, terribly good.
As the 1980s began, Romana was followed by Nyssa. And then there was Tegan.
I demand to see who's ever in charge of this ship.
Tegan was this feisty stewardess who there was real moral concern in her, and I think all the best Doctor Who women, like Sarah Jane, had this, real drive and moral concern and enthusiasm, which was incredibly appealing.
That settles it. She's got to come with us.
Settles what? Now, wait a minute, Doctor!
I love Tegan. I love the idea of this Australian stewardess who's kind of put up with, boorish male executives getting drunk, that she would be an ideal person to be running the TARDIS, which is essentially a giant first-class Qantas loo.
Now look, young lady, make yourself useful. This young fellow looks as though he needs some refreshment, and I know that Susan and I do too.
Hang on a minute.
Tegan, I'll humour him. I sometimes used to get a little tetchy. Fortunately, one mellows with age.
The Doctor's next companion was also quick to answer back. Perry was a botany student, but in her very first episode, we weren't looking at her credentials as an academic. Mel was a brilliant computer programmer and a brilliant screamer. Then there was Ace. She was not a huge departure from other companions, an ordinary girl we can relate to, feisty and brave, no matter how much she was frightened. But the writers took pains to develop the character. We learned about her past, even met her old friends. And it's their interest in her as a woman, not as a cipher, that makes the significant change.
I love the bit with Ace and the baseball bat.
Small human female sighted on level 3.
What are you calling small?
Everyone who hasn't wanted to bash a Dalek.
Reinforcements requested.
My husband, who actually grew up not in quite posh South London, hated Ace because he thought she was a southerner's idea of a rough estate girl and was clearly far too posh. So maybe that tells you more about me, that I really liked her.
What is it?
Something's happening.
When Doctor Who returned briefly in 1996, the Doctor's whole attitude to his companions had changed.
I know who I am! I am the Doctor!
Good! Now do that again.
I think the wonderful thing about Grace in the TV movie is that she chose not to travel with the Doctor. And she was one of the few people that made that decision outright, especially given the relationship that she developed with him over such a short time.
Come with me.
You come with me.
Me come with you.
Yes.
Me come with you. It's tempting.
I think you have to be an incredibly strong person, let alone a strong woman, to give up the opportunity to travel through all of time and space. Yes, you might be putting your life at danger, but who wouldn't want to have that sort of experience at their fingertips?
Since the series came back in 2005, the companions have continued to be ordinary women we can relate to who step up to extraordinary challenges.
The thing about Rose for me is that she's essentially my age. I think I'm about a year older. So it's very easy to put myself in her shoes.
By the way, did I mention it also travels in time?
Some people have seen similarities between Rose and Ace.
They've grown up in relatively similar backgrounds, albeit decades apart, and they've both jumped at the opportunity to travel with this strange man, which is saying something about their upbringings, really. I think the fundamental difference between the Doctor and Ace's relationship and the Doctor and Rose's relationship is the intimacy that it then evolves between Rose and the Doctor. It's not the first time we've seen intimacy between him and a potential companion, but it's the first one that we see develop properly on screen, and it's given time.
I love you.
Quite right.
Where Rose fell for the Doctor immediately, the next three companions all played harder to get. Donna just wanted to get away from him.
I just want a mate.
You just want to mate.
I just want a mate.
You're not mating with me, sunshine.
Martha didn't think much of him calling himself Doctor.
Just the Doctor.
What, people call you the Doctor?
Yeah.
Well, I'm not. As far as I'm concerned, you've got to earn that title.
River was always one step ahead of him.
Stabilisers!
And the harder it was for the Doctor to win these women over, the greater the achievement. Strong women make him all the more remarkable.
If I was 11 years old, growing up, watching Doctor Who now, I would want to be River, full stop. She's so strong, she's so funny. And I think that's not really something, other than Donna, I don't think that that's something that was particularly addressed in the earlier episodes of Doctor Who. I don't think the women were nearly as fun.
What are you doing here?
Well, I was on my way to this gay gypsy bar mitzvah for the disabled when I suddenly thought, gosh, the Third Reich's a bit rubbish. I think I'll kill the Führer. Who's with me?
Shoot her.
Tip for you all. Never shoot a girl while she's regenerating.
River Song just epitomises that strong character, be it male or female.
We've seen River's story from the day she died back to the day she was born. And in recent years, we've caught up with Sarah Jane and Jo and seen the legacy of their time with the Doctor. That's true of Amy. We met her as a child, then 12 years later when she'd grown up to be a kissogram. And 2 years later on her wedding night. We've seen her married, give birth and grow old. As Jo pointed out when she met the 11th Doctor.
I only left you because I got married.
What was once a reason to write out a character now inspires new adventures. Things have certainly changed. But how much do the Doctor Who girls challenge attitudes to women? And how much does the series change those attitudes? Perhaps one way to explore this subject is to look at the Doctor's male companions. How much do they scream, get things wrong, need rescuing? Do they get a better or a worse deal?
You're improving, Harry.
Am I really?
Yes, your mind is beginning to work. It's entirely due to my influence, of course. You mustn't take any credit.
I am fascinated by the male assistants in Doctor Who. I think, apart from Harry, who was quite sexist and deliberately set up, I think, to be so against Sarah Jane, there haven't really been any who are kind of major virile sort of threats to the Doctor. And you know, Harry was clearly supposed to be an action man, and then they didn't need him when Tom Baker took over from John Pertwee.
Look, I've been thinking about your wish to return home.
And?
Well, I thought that if we could work out a satisfactory course, I might give it a try.
Well, I've already done so, Doctor.
Really?
As you can see here, I've even managed to calculate the way into the CVE, the gateway through E-space.
I think Adric's intelligence and his flouting of his intelligence slightly sets him apart from any other companion, be it male or female. He's quite intense with that. He's quite comfortable in the knowledge that he is a mathematical genius.
Do you really want to go home?
No, of course not. There's nothing there for me anymore.
So you've done all these calculations for nothing?
Well, it made a point, didn't it?
He's not a very strong character. He's not a very strong person.
You used to be a time agent. Now you're some kind of freelancer.
Ooh, that's a little harsh. I like to think of myself as a criminal.
I bet you do.
He was quite an interesting contrast in his morally grey attitude to stepping in and meddling with time, which is in direct contrast with the Doctor wanting to step back.
Excellent bottom. So, Ben, there's a time and a place.
He also represented that slightly more open-mindedness about sexual orientation, which is addressed as soon as he steps in, really.
I gotta go meet a girl, but you got an excellent bottom, too.
I have a message and a question. A message from the Doctor and a question from me. Where is my wife?
Rory is very interesting now, and I think one of the most fascinating assistants because he's this nurse, which was traditionally a female profession. He's a very modern young man, who wants to be an involved husband and father. And I think there's something very interesting there with the exploration of masculinity going on through Rory.
Would you like me to repeat the question?
In some Doctor Who stories, the Doctor's companion is the only woman in the cast. Does that matter?
Joe, Miss Grant here is my assistant.
It really does matter if you have few or no women in a show like Doctor Who. In fact, when people don't notice, that's almost the most dangerous thing of all, because you're excluding 50% of your viewers and implying that they don't really matter and they don't have these kind of adventures. Looking back right to the early days of Doctor Who, often the most interesting women were those who were playing, aliens, often villains, which is always a satisfying role, or were, part of that guest team of scientists. And I remember in Tomb of the Cybermen in particular, you had this multiracial kind of, gender diverse team coming in. And often that's how you introduced new ideas and stereotypes, even if inevitably most of them are going to die.
Director Pennant Roberts would sometimes cast women in parts written for men.
And we'll do the same to the collector when we find him, won't we, citizens?
What's interesting looking at the idea of gender-blind casting, that you might cast a woman in a part originally written for a man, is it just shows you that if you have a great part and you're willing to just experiment, you could get something amazing out of it. And so you could argue Honor Blackman character, The Avengers, is proof of what happens when you take that risk. Overall, what you watch on screen is the result usually of someone having the guts to say, just cast someone interesting. And although Leela was obviously written for a woman, I think there's something completely non-gendered about her character. And that's the key, isn't it, to a great part.
There have been several strong women villains in Doctor Who. Is that empowering or insulting?
Surrender to me what is mine by right of conquest. Give me Excalibur.
Never!
I don't find female villains in Doctor Who particularly empowering, especially as a lot of the time they're often defeated after cackling maniacally. They're not necessarily the most intelligent of the Doctor Who monsters.
And these are not what you would call human. They are cultivated in test tubes. We have very good scientists. I am a living being. They are products, and inferior products, grown for a purpose and capable of nothing more.
Grown for what purpose?
To fight.
I think it's quite interesting how many of the female villains in Doctor Who are individuals, whereas the main recurring monsters in Doctor Who are often male or gender indifferent. You have the Cybermen; they are essentially all men. Even the females that get assimilated are men.
I did my duty. Oh, God. I did my duty.
Daleks have a very masculine voice. The Sontarans are all male. The Judoon are male. Maybe that means that the female villains, maybe that makes them stand out more and is more empowering. But I don't think they're given the intelligence. I think they are parodied.
But it's not just the women on screen. Doctor Who still has relatively few female writers, directors or producers. Does a lack of women behind the camera mean Doctor Who has a particularly male attitude to women and relationships with them?
I don't think Doctor Who would be as successful as it is if it didn't do that well. If the women in Doctor Who weren't well-rounded on the whole, I don't think it would have lasted as long as it has.
The first ever Doctor Who girl, Susan, wasn't just his companion. She was his granddaughter. Writer Anthony Coburn felt it wasn't quite proper for an old man to be travelling around the galaxy with a young girl.
I think Doctor Who, in the writing, has often reinforced this May to December idea of, you know, the older, wiser man and the young apprentice at best, but more like the Eliza Doolittle character. But of course, Eliza Doolittle famously left the professor and outgrew him.
I've got to go. This Professor Jones, he's fighting for everything that's important, everything that you fought for. In a funny way, he reminds me of a sort of younger you.
I don't know whether to feel flattered or insulted.
Jo Grant's decision to leave the Doctor, I've always had a little bit of a problem with it because it's almost as if she was tucked away, she's going to go and get married, and that's the only reason for her to leave is because she's found a better man. The fact that Martha finds happiness by marrying Mickey. It's okay because Donna's now found a new man. Rose is only happy because she's been shoved into an alternative dimension with a copy of the Doctor that she can have forever to herself. But it all comes together to show that these women only seem to be happy once they found a man in their lives. So whereas the Doctor's not necessarily doesn't necessarily come and meddle with people and tell you how to live your life, I don't think the show necessarily does the same.
For decades, there was no suggestion of anything improper between the Doctor and his companions.
What was in that box that Blitz and Dipper were so interested in?
More recently, we've seen the Doctor kissing his companions, even falling in love. But his attitude to women is still coy, embarrassed, awkward. No wonder so many of us leave the Doctor for other men. Anyway, is it quite proper for us to fancy the Doctor?
We should definitely not fancy the Doctor. It's really wrong to me. I think you need that childlike sense of the fantasy of the adventure, and once it becomes about fancying the Doctor, it sort of becomes about a series of extended dates through space.
You're taking me to the same planets that you took her.
What's wrong with that?
Nothing. Just ever heard the word rebound?
I think it's more that the Doctor is this, it's this figure that you can project anything onto because you don't really know who they are. And in theory, they could be a woman. So there's that potential. And then their relationship with assistants, because no one ever quite stays the course, is not permanent. In that sense, there's eternal wish fulfillment possible through the Doctor. And I see the Doctor kind of leading the way into a world of adventure.
There's a cliched image of Doctor Who fans as spotty, nerdy boys. But the viewing figures show that women have always made up a large part of the television audience.
Overall, I'm one of these people who's very wary about labelling Doctor Who fans by gender and saying is it a very male thing, being a Whovian. I wonder if I could say that there seems to be something about a male capacity to compile endless lists and obsess on detail, which perhaps is a lot of what core Doctor Who fandom is about, and being able to trace these storylines back over many different episodes. And perhaps women just enjoy them without obsessing about the kind of bus map level of detail.
But then again, in a lot of US fandom, Doctor Who fandom, you get, I think it's more balanced. There are more women fans, more female fans. And then you have the element of cosplay. And you have the cross-dressing of the women coming in and dressing up as the Doctor.
How about this, Doctor?
Exactly, good heavens, that's exactly right.
And if women are already dressing up as the Doctor, what's to stop the next Doctor being a woman?
Exactly. Oh.
Don't you like it?
I'm fascinated by this question of will there ever be a woman Doctor?
No, the arms are just fine.
Now the role has sort of been written a certain way. There's something a bit James Bond about it, and I think, like with James Bond, it's a franchise that kind of feels set in its ways, and I don't see it's a formula they're going to mess with. But a part of me wants to see someone like Margaret Rutherford. And if you think back to William Hartnell, you know, the early Doctor was this kind of crotchety old man. You know, you could have had, by logic, you could have had a Margaret Rutherford, kind of crotchety old woman. But that's such a challenge to how we think about TV, and it says so much that, you know, all these decades on from the start of Doctor Who, the idea of casting a woman over 50 as the Doctor is far more ridiculous than casting some ludicrous alien.
Maybe that means it's time for us to see a female Doctor. Maybe there's that wish for more than just an honorary time lady popping in every so often.